Hello, my name is Neil, and welcome to Genesis to Paul. This channel exists to explore one central question: where does Paul's relational theology come from? Many people read Paul as if his ideas about men and women, the church, authority, and relationships appear suddenly in the New Testament. But Paul himself doesn't think that way. Paul reads Scripture as a unified story, and again, he traces relational order back to creation. That's why this channel is called Genesis to Paul. Because if we want to understand Paul properly, we have to begin where Paul begins. Not with culture, not with power, not with later theological debates, but with Genesis. In this first video, I want to explain what this project is about and why relational order matters so much for understanding Paul. Let me begin by naming the problem. Modern readers often approach Paul with a set of assumptions. We assume he is talking about authority. We assume he is talking about hierarchy. We assume he is trying to regulate power. And once those assumptions are in place, Paul's letters quickly become confusing or even offensive. But what if those assumptions are wrong? What if Paul is not primarily talking about power at all? What if Paul is instead working with a relational grammar that he inherits from Genesis? That is the claim this series explores. Paul does not invent a new relational logic. He receives one, and that logic begins with creation. In Genesis 1 and 2, human beings are created in relationship, not as isolated individuals, but as persons whose identity is given in relation to others. Man is created first. Woman is created from man. But that order is not about superiority. It is about origin. One comes from the other, and that pattern of one out of the other becomes foundational. Paul does not treat this as incidental. He treats it as theological. When Paul talks about image, glory, headship, love, submission, or the church, he repeatedly reaches back to creation. Not to justify domination, but to describe relational order. This is where many readings go wrong. They confuse order with hierarchy. They confuse origin with inequality. They confuse relational direction with power. Paul does none of those things. Instead, Paul works with a consistent pattern. Identity is given. Order flows from identity. Posture reflects that order. Action expresses that posture. This fourfold grammar runs through Paul's letters, especially in places like 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, and Colossians. But unless we see its roots in Genesis, we will misread Paul every time. That is why this series moves slowly. It builds deliberately, and it insists on reading Paul in continuity with Scripture, not in isolation from it. Let me be very clear about what this channel is not. This channel is not about culture wars. It is not about scoring points. It is not about flattening differences. And it is not about defending domination. It is about understanding Paul on his own terms. And Paul's terms are deeply relational. Paul believes that God's own life is relational. He believes creation reflects that relationality. And he believes the church is meant to live it out. That is why order matters. Not as control, not as coercion, but as the visible shape of faithfulness. Throughout this series, we will look carefully at key texts. We will ask why Paul uses the language he uses. We will notice when he gives commands and when he describes posture, and we will pay close attention to what Paul never says, because sometimes what Paul does not say is just as important as what he does. So this first video sets the stage. Genesis matters for Paul. Relational order matters for Paul. And unless we begin there, we will never hear Paul clearly. In the next videos, we'll begin tracing this pattern step by step, from Genesis 2 to image and glory, to worship, to the household, and finally to the church itself. If you want to follow the argument in order, start at the beginning of the playlist. And thank you for being here.